But like I was saying, yeah, we're going to begin with a lecture from Mr. Rodriguez, have some very brief traditional Q&A, and then move into an interactive to get everybody working and thinking on these issues together. We're so excited to have you here. Please, at any moment, feel free to go out and get some snacks, some refreshments, and don't forget to sign in and take some promotional materials for additional events coming up, including the April 15th third forum around racism as a public health issue, which you can find more information about over there. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, man. All right. First of all, I want to just say thanks everyone for spending your Saturday afternoon with us. And with that, happy Black History Month. I think it's very important that we recognize this month, but also some news stories about how history and Black identity in America has not yet been told. And that's one of the motivations that drives my work, is thinking about news stories that can teach us something very different about history, about our shared identity and our shared sort of society. For instance, today, most of the talk will focus on Boston, with some sort of hints at sort of broader context in the US and also around the world. So again, thank you for being here, and to give a little introduction to my biographical sort of agent and co-conspirator in my work, Dr. Hinton, very special person in the city of Boston, is an eminent scientist, and we're going to get into some of his biography, but in composing the sort of the talking points, I wanted to explore ways that we can think about how our shared experience and our lived experience with racism actually has an impact on our work, right? Actually can help gear or motivate us to design certain interventions, and particularly when we think about public health, what are ways in which those interventions can take form? So these are some of the questions that I had as I was putting this together, and I hope we could follow along, and then also in our activity work together in coming up with some new ideas. All right. So here I have some facts about Dr. Hinton, but before I get there, I want to just give a little backstory. So Dr. Hinton, Dr. William Augustus Hinton, his friends called him Gus, was born in 1882, I believe, and was born in Chicago. His parents had survived enslavement in the U.S. South and had migrated north with the Great Migration of many other African American families after the end of slavery. So in Chicago, he grows up. He is a very ambitious young man, and he graduates school as one of the youngest members of his high school at 16. He decides to attend University of Kansas, and he does for about a period of one academic year. However, he had to withdraw from his education because he no longer could afford attending University of Kansas. A few years later, he decides to transfer and apply to Harvard College, where he is admitted, and he is one of very few African Americans in the college at that time. He is admitted in 1903 and graduates in 1905. Between the end of his college education and the beginning of his medical school education, he travels back to Kansas and Oklahoma to teach. He decides on teaching basic science courses and is really interested in science. Again, it sort of helps to think that in 1905, very few African American men were actually allowed to study science or were actually encouraged to do so. So at a very young age, Dr. William Hinton is already pushing barriers beyond his expectations. In 1909, he returns to Harvard. He begins his medical education. I think for many of us who live in Boston, but particularly for us who have attended Harvard, it is a very difficult place today, and as such, it was a very difficult place to study in 1909. But Dr. William Hinton begins medical education around the time where the standardization of American medical education is being shaped by what was called the Flexner Report. Does anyone here know what the Flexner Report is? What? Yes?
Yeah, so he wrote it to kind of modernize American medical education in the 1910s, based on like the European model.
Right. So Flexner was actually had no medical education, yet he is given sponsorship by the Carnegie Institute at the time to develop a sort of study of American medical education. And some of his findings are troubling, but in particularly what Flexner writes about African American medical education suggests that it ought to be race specific. That is to say that only white doctors should focus on white patients and black doctors should focus on black patients. Now this, as you can imagine, is a national report, but someone like Hinton reading this in his first year of medical school has to really engage with what it means for him to be one of the only African Americans in Harvard Medical School at the time. So that is some context as to like how to think about what it meant to feel, what it meant for Hinton to feel who he was in an institution like Harvard at the time. Yet, as we will continue to see this pattern, it does not deter him from excelling in his work. He graduates in 3 years as opposed to the traditional 4 years. He graduates with honors at the top of his class, and in 1912, the trend in medical practice was a specialty in surgery. Surgery was beginning to really take a primary place in medical practice. Many hospitals were beginning to really engage and turn to surgery, specifically towards the late 19th century with anesthesia and sort of as a sort of preeminent medical practice. Suffice to say, for Hinton, this wasn't the case. For Hinton, as he turns to surgery, and we have some correspondence, some letters of his saying that he wanted to turn to surgery because what he saw in the U.S. South as being the most the most impactful medical practice was to have more surgeries. Like any of us sort of graduate students, as we finish our degree at Harvard, we're beginning to think about what opportunities are there for our professional development in Boston. Hinton had the same question. However, at that time, all of the leading hospitals in the city of Boston had explicit policies that were discriminatory against African Americans. That is to say, despite Hinton having graduated and excelling at the most elite institution in the world, he was deterred from, sorry, what was that?
I said, so said a Harvard graduate.
Yes, so said a Harvard graduate. I guess what I'm really trying to emphasize is, despite having the credentials that you can muster, especially as a black man in 1912, he was deterred from residencies in these leading hospitals because of his race. He was unable to acquire any funding in any position to specialize in surgery, despite having his credentials and despite knowing and working in Boston at the time. I have a picture of Harvard Medical School circa 19. Where is it here? Doesn't have it here. I think this is. Sorry, Dr. Al. This is
I think
circa
it's actually 1912.
1912. So this is Harvard Medical School, circa 1912, to give us a picture of what the structure looked like at the time. I'll return back to this image to give some more context, but just wanted to place this with an image. So what does a young black man do when he is unable to get residency despite having the credentials and despite having the ambition to practice surgery in Boston? Well, for Hinton, it was, from Hinton and from my perspective, I believe what was the major factor here was Hinton's mentors. Hinton was able to have certain mentors that taught him at Harvard, but that also understood the social context of what it meant to study medicine as a black man in the city and in the medical profession. And with his mentors, he was able to practice sort of alternative emerging fields in medicine. Particularly, he was encouraged to work in the laboratories. So between his graduation in 1912 and 1915, Hinton worked often on a volunteer basis, but worked in the laboratories of Massachusetts General Hospital, and I believe at the Department of Preventative Medicine at Harvard, again as a minor instructor role, but engaging in how to think about certain diseases from the laboratory perspective. Because it became clear to him that surgery was not his route forward, turning to the laboratory and turning to his mentors who allowed him to enter the laboratory and learn what it meant to engage in laboratory science through medical practice was really his pivot point at that time. So in 1915, Harvard University sort of transferred management and administration of the Wasserman Laboratory for syphilis testing over to the Massachusetts Department of Health. So in 1915, the Massachusetts Department of Public Health inaugurates its Wasserman Laboratory, and William Hinton is invited to come on as assistant director of the laboratory. So given his 3 years of sort of volunteer work, he's rewarded with an official position by the state. And I bring up our photo again because the Wasserman Laboratory is not where it is currently today in Jamaica Plain, but in 1915 it was still housed at Harvard Medical School, specifically in the building. Hinton goes on to write later on in his life that he wanted to pursue again surgery, but because Harvard Medical School needed his services, he decided to stay. And I like to share that because it shows the value that Hinton understood he could bring through the laboratory, through such a pioneering field, yet also in a space that was not yet deterred by racial anxieties in Boston. The laboratory was such a new sort of space that Hinton saw it to be a place where he could really contribute through his knowledge. Since 1915 inauguration, and I believe in the early 1950s when the lab is transferred over to its current place in Jamaica Plain, the lab remained at Harvard Medical School, but it did move around throughout different buildings. Again, until it was later transferred to Jamaica Plain. So Hinton's early medical career, and by the way, this is one of the earliest photos we have of William Hinton as a young medical doctor in Boston. Very few photos exist of him, especially as a young man. So Yeah, that's kind of cool. Before I go on through Hinton, I wanted to sort of make bring some context in about the disease that Hinton decided to study. So in 1915, syphilis was already a issue for Boston. It was also an issue for most of the world. As a sexually transmitted infection, it was very difficult to adequately intervene in the course of the disease. What Hinton was able to, so because syphilis was already an issue, I want to just sort of add to that syphilis was also a racialized disease. That is to say, many medical opinions of the time stipulated that African Americans were biologically infected with the disease. Now, this came from statistical reports, and it came from many ideas revolving around the natural inferiority of different races around the world. However, in the United States, syphilis and the African American body is sort of predominantly mentioned in the medical literature. To add on to this, the emergence of eugenics of this time allowed these ideas to sort of accelerate very rapidly in the scientific literature. We see social scientists, we see epidemiologists, we see many other different fields of science engaging rapidly with the eugenics thought and practices, in addition to, or I guess you could say, in compounding with the anxieties around syphilis as they are existed at the time. I want to bring this up front and center because these are the many different anxieties that Hinton faced while he was a young doctor. He understood that syphilis was already being racialized, but he also understood that racism in this country was very real. Racism in this country affected him and had affected his ability to learn and to grow and to study. So in 1927, the laboratory test for syphilis was already well established, and that was called the Wasserman test, which lends its name to the Wasserman laboratory in which Hinton worked. However, one of the things that Hinton realized very early on was that the Wasserman test had a very high percentage of false positives. That is to say, it was not the most reliable test for syphilis, despite it having such a cultural and scientific sort of acumen. Through his experience between 1915 and 1920, in the mid-1920s, being in the position to really look and study and work with the test so closely, it allowed Hinton to identify areas to improve the test. And in 1927, he published these, what he called improvements, but also adjusting some of the features of the test. Now today I don't want to get into the sort of technical details of the test, but it was a blood test that was exposed to certain antigens and that would demonstrate or sort of show whether syphilis was active or not active in the bloodstream. Hinton was able to, again, adjust some of these techniques, and in doing so, he was able to sort of innovate a brand new way of testing syphilis in the blood. As he went around town talking about his new technique, certain faculty members at MGH at the time thought it should be called the Hinton test. And the name stuck. The name stayed as sort of an indicator that this was an improved Wasserman test. We have some documentation to show that Hinton's motivation behind the test was both to make it superior in identifying syphilis, but also to make it more economical. And the reason he wanted to make the test more economical was so that it could be used more widespread. Specifically, as he notes in his writings, that part of why the idea that syphilis and the black body were so intertwined was because there were very few serologic interventions in the black community. It was very expensive to test widely in certain socioeconomic settings, so making a test that was more accurate and more economical would directly intervene in this regard. Towards the end of the 20s and into the early 30s, the Hinton test really picks up steam in Boston. Hinton, in addition to, is tasked with standardizing the Wasserman test across all sort of auxiliary laboratories in the state. That is to say, at the time, syphilis testing was not centralized, but every little town, for instance, Brookline, had its small laboratories, and they too were conducting laboratory tests. But in the late 20s and early 30s, Massachusetts Department of Public Health decided to standardize these tests. And to do that, they charged Hinton with really sort of leading that transition. With that task of standardizing the test, the Hinton test becomes sort of the official Massachusetts test, and Massachusetts is the first state to recognize it as so. But into 1935, the United States Public Health Service, through congressional funds, decides to ramp up its syphilis intervention, and they consult Hinton as a special consultant, but they bring him in to help them standardize syphilis testing across the country. And this is very significant, not only for Hinton's medical career, but also for Massachusetts' role in helping to standardize syphilis testing across the country. Before I get to the last point, it is in the late 20s and early 30s where the Hinton test also makes its way across the world. And in parts of my work, I examine how Central American countries adopted the Hinton technique and developed public health infrastructure around that sort of model. Very few scholars have actually examined ways in which medical and diagnostic technology has done that in other parts of the world, but Hinton is certainly one of the few that we have documented as sort of directly informing and directly sort of modeling sort of international. I think there's more work to be done there, but that's sort of a global context into which William Hinton was able to change public health. In 1936, Hinton accumulates all of his work into a medical textbook called Syphilis and Its Treatment. The medical textbook was published by Macmillan in 1936, and it was the first medical textbook published by an African American author. And this is very significant, again, because the topic here is syphilis, and a close reading of the book shows some ideas as to what Hinton thought about race in science. Specifically, he was very clear that it did not determine the course of syphilis, but that because of the socioeconomic status of many African American communities at the time, it was a sort of what he called a disease of the underprivileged. And with that phrase, I think that Hinton is really sort of pointing to lack of education, lack of sort of public health services that could be sort of created in the service of including many of these vulnerable populations. There were some publications and drawings of Hinton. There's a series of children's books that were written by a poet. His name's escaping me today, but the poet decided to do children's books, and one of the features was William Hinton. And the poet writes that because Hinton worked in the laboratory, which you can imagine was an enclosed space, it was not a sort of theatrical academic field, but it was one that was sort of within an enclosed space. Very few people actually knew what Hinton looked like. And I think this is interesting because if you read medical literature of the time, there is nothing that William Hinton writes that indicates his identity. The name Hinton, again, doesn't necessarily mark his identity in any way. So very few people actually knew Hinton was an African American man. And this was both advantageous to William Hinton, and it was also something that he struggled with for most of his life. Up here, I just wanted to show some data that was gathered, specifically gathered by Dr. Al, who's in the audience, and he shared with me. But between, we don't have the dates here, but I think
Not
this
in
is
real time.
we have time. Between 1918 and 1983, what I really want us to show is that there is a kind of even detection of syphilis up until the Hinton test is invented. And this just shows how many cases of infection there would be missed. And then here we see the introduction of penicillin, which was a rapid treatment for syphilis, one that far exceeded anything prior to its invention. So Hinton, in addition to being a public servant, was also an instructor at Harvard. And again, this was not very well established, but because the laboratory, the Wasserman Laboratory, was housed in Harvard Medical School, Hinton was sort of Hinton's role grew into an important role in teaching new medical students how to run the syphilis technique and how to test for the disease. I just wanted to show here some key moments in which his development as an academic sort of progressed. As you can see, well into the 40s, Hinton was still an instructor and lecturer. That is to say that his advancement in the academy was not sort of the same as other academics or other professors. He didn't sort of rise from the assistant professorship, associate professorship, to the tenured faculty as one would expect, but was kept at a sort of instructor level for most of his career. In 1949, at the sort of eve of the end of his career, Harvard Medical School decides to name him clinical professor in bacteriology, and that marks the first time the institution tenured an African American scholar. And Hinton very well deserved this title. However, one could imagine the anxiety of having to work every year and not having security in the sense of tenure or in the sense of a steady progress. There's also documentation that shows Hinton's salary was cut significantly through the years, particularly in the 30s. Despite achieving eminent success with his medical technology, there were times where his salary was cut by 50% or more, and he was often moved around the Harvard institution from the medical school to the public health school, and so there was really no stability for his career. And I think that allows us to see how racism operated even in a subtle way, and despite acclaim and sort of scientific contribution, it was very much present in the day. He retires in 1950, becomes emeriti professor emeritus professor, and continues his work with the Massachusetts Department of Public Health for a few years before officially retiring from the laboratory there. So returning to some of his recognition, which I think is very important. In 1938, William Hinton is nominated and awarded the Spingarn Award from the NAACP. The Spingarn Award is one of the highest recognitions that the organization offers, and has been given to other eminent scholars and folks we've come to recognize, and that history has recognized. However, what's interesting about Hinton is that he rejects the award in 1930. And he rejects the award because, as he writes to a friend, he was weary and anxious that receiving a recognition from the NAACP in 1938, 1939 would severely deter and negatively impact his scientific contributions. So, as Hinton sort of knew and understood that his identity was the very subject of sort of medical opinion in syphilis research, he felt that national recognition of who he was and the contribution of his identity to the African American culture in the United States would deter his sort of scientific contribution. We don't really, this interesting, the actual award was sent out to engrave before the NAACP received Hinton's decline. So we have correspondence of the organization unsure what to do because this was the first time anyone had declined this award. And I think that might be a good sort of story on the side, but it is something that, in other words, the award exists. It's out there. We don't know where it is, and we're not sure if it's in the NAACP archive, but there is an award with William Hinton's name. In 1955, after his retirement, Ebony Magazine conducts an interview of William Hinton. They visit him in his Canton farmhouse, so he lived in Canton. They visit him there, and he's a little bit more open about his experience and his career. But he still maintains that race should not get mixed up with the struggles of the human world. Hinton was a scientist. Hinton believed in the scientific practice and study of medicine. However, I feel that he struggled very much with being who he was in the environment in which he worked. And I think that helps us understand racism in public health from a different perspective. One that is not just about the population that public health serves, but also one about the experts and the folks who are innovating in the field of public health and how we experience racism. I think that through William Hinton, we can see how medicine changes over time, but also, I would say, the lack of his recognition is evidence that it just doesn't change fast enough. In the fall of 2019, Harvard Medical School, I would say, finally moved with enough haste to recognize William Hinton's contribution as a faculty member. This portrait was commissioned and put on display in the Waterhouse Room of Gordon Hall, which is sort of the eminent room for Harvard faculty in medicine. Hinton's portrait is the only one of its kind aesthetically for two reasons. One, because it is showing his laboratory to an extent. No other portrait in the room has the faculty member with sort of the backdrop of where they worked. So I think it shows Hinton as a leader, but also someone who took a space and was able to transform that space into something serviceable for the greater public. Just a side note, however, the laboratory the artist decided to paint here is not a early 20th century laboratory. This is more of a early to mid 19th century laboratory. We can get into why, but I just wanted to share that that's not exactly the sort of, that's not the accurate depiction of the Wasserman Laboratory in 1920. Yeah, that's all I have today. So I'd like to thank you all again. And if you have any questions, my email is here. I'd love to answer and open to any conversations. But thank you again. Dr. Al.
So in your investigations, which is very difficult, there's very little left behind of personal nature on Dr. Hinton. But during the 1920s, 30s, 40s, into the 50s, he was a major consultant to the U.S. Public Health Service on syphilis. So it leads me to think he must have known the nature of the studies being done in Tuskegee during that time. But there's no evidence that he ever spoke out about it or commented on it. Did you find anything that indicated that he was even aware of that?
Sure, that's probably the most common question I've been getting as I'm sort of finalizing my research is to what extent was William Hinton aware, even as a participant in the syphilis study that took place in Tuskegee. To the best of our knowledge and to the best I've been able to gather from the documents available to me, that comes down to sort of twofold. On the one hand, William Hinton's test was the superior test in detecting syphilis at the time of Tuskegee. So in the first Tuskegee publication, which was in 1936, titled Untreated Syphilis in the Male Negro, they describe the standardization of the syphilis test as being sort of a precondition for even starting Tuskegee. And in their discussion of having this test standardized, he is cited as him and I believe the other four serologists at the time who were really developing the test. They were cited as having been fundamental to beginning Tuskegee. So in other words, and from my interpretation, his test was pivotal in sort of an objective study of syphilis. Now I like to think that Hinton, I like to think that the science of Tuskegee was not incorrect, right? The sort of comparative study of disease in a population that had been done before Tuskegee, and that was a method for identifying sort of or mapping the incidence of disease in a population. So that science was not necessarily unethical. What was unethical about Tuskegee was the conditions in which it was carried out. Sort of the lying and misleading of the Alabama population, and specifically the African American men sharecroppers, the misleading and sort of withholding of treatment when it was available. That part was sort of the unethical aspect. So if we look at that, if we take those two sides and we look at the test, his test in itself was not the problem, but it was the way in which his test was used by the U.S. Public Health Service physicians of the time to carry out the unethical study. That is, I think, the interesting part. On the other hand, Hinton did not really believe that the treatments for syphilis before antibiotics were very effective. He felt they were very expensive and they actually brought on more harm to the individual than they actually treated the disease. So it might be possible that Hinton was on board with not providing treatment, but he definitely would not have been on board once penicillin was available. I think that certainly would have been where he would have said, no, penicillin needs to be provided. But when it was the sort of arsenic-based treatment for syphilis, he would have seen it as not economically efficient. However, none of the literature on Tuskegee really ever gave credit to the serologists because they viewed them as technicians in the laboratory and not as sort of scientific contributors to the overall study. And I think that looking at it through that view, like that perspective, that's something that followed Hinton throughout his career, where even Harvard didn't want to give him his recognition because they saw him as an instructor, as a technician instructor in a laboratory, rather than an eminent scholar and scientist that he was. So that's probably the best way I can chart those waters, but I think certainly in the biography that I hope to engage in seriously after my studies, and certainly that's a question that is central to the study. Yes, sir.
What information do you have about his personal life? You said he lived in Canton.
Yes.
Was he married? Did he have children? There's a biography that's just come out about Monroe Trotter. And I was surprised, shocked to find out that he had committed suicide. He was so overwhelmed and overtaken by racism that he eventually gave up his life. And I'm wondering, just again, what was Hinton's personal life like?
That's a great question. So Hinton did get married. He got married to Ada. Her first name is Ada Halls, I believe was the last name. But she took on the Hinton name, so Ada Hinton in 1909, right when he starts medical school. Ada is very active in Boston, sort of leads some of early social work in the city. But when they moved to Canton, they had two daughters. One of which, her name was Jane Hinton. She was one of the first veterinarians, African American women veterinarians in the field. So she goes on to have her own career. But from what we do have in reflection of Hinton's life, were a series of interviews that were recorded in the 1970s. And the interviews don't interview Hinton himself because he had passed by then, but they interviewed his colleagues, they interviewed his staff and his family. And from the audio, we get a better sense of Hinton's struggle and a better sense of how he had to sort of manage the life, his family life with his work life. I think the Jane Hinton audio recording gives the most about how difficult it was. For example, she cites that she was sent to boarding school in Europe at a very young age, and that affected her severely. But I think if we put some context around that, Hinton may have understood that her education in America as a black woman would have been much worse. So going to Europe and studying there, again, we don't really know that for sure, but one could sort of contextualize how difficult it was and how much value he placed on education. So there is that tussle that we see. And to your earlier point of mental health, Hinton in his later life was interned at McLean Hospital for some time. We're not sure if it was due to dementia or other aspects, but I would certainly say his long life of having to deal or having to really work around racism in the medical field in Boston greatly accelerated that. So those are some of the personal sort of perspectives that we can sort of gather. But like Dr. Gal said, it's been very difficult because he did not leave a sort of archive for the historian. But unfortunately, Harvard did not move enough to build an archive for him. Most of his papers, his early papers, were held and recovered by the Public Health Museum in Tewksbury. And there is now a sort of move to try to, and that's something that I've been a part of, to try to get an archive of William Hinton at Harvard, just like any other Emeriti faculty member would have. There isn't any reason, I always say Harvard is in the business of preserving its faculty's work. Hinton's case shouldn't be any different. But that's the historian's job. Yeah. All right.
Thank you so much. I see a lot more questions, and so we're going to take a short break for everyone to have some snacks, to take a breather, and then we're going to come back and engage with medical Q&A in the social practice clinic component. So, yeah.
So stick around. Thank you.